Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. We've talked a fair bit over time in these talks about not self and emptiness. And I'd like to consider this evening the question not from a theoretical, doctrinal kind of point of view, but how we can live with it and what benefit it has to take that on board as a way of holding the mind. One of the Buddha's sayings, he was asked by a Brahmin student, how can I escape from the gaze of the Lord of Death? And the Buddha's answer was, be ever mindful, see the world as empty, and abandon thoughts of self. Kind of three aspects to that. And of course, escaping the gaze of the Lord of Death doesn't mean achieving literal physical immortality, but it means, has levels of meaning. In the highest level, it means escaping from the cycle of birth and death altogether. But on a more immediate level, it means escaping from the fear of death. This is one of the great benefits of seeing things in terms of emptiness and not self, is fearlessness, freedom from fear in general. This fear is a very negative, paralyzing kind of a state of mind. That when we're fearful, we're afraid to move, to do anything. It becomes a crippling kind of state of mind, and it's counterproductive. And fear comes from a fear of loss to what's seen as essential. If you have taken your stand on a self position, then any kind of change is going to be seen as a threat to the self. But if you have a way of holding the mind in emptiness, in non-substantiality, in just being mindful of the ongoing process without identifying to it, then there's nothing to fear, because there's nothing to lose. Underlying the idea of self is many ways of approaching that, but one of the components of the idea of self, identification to a self, is a feeling of substantiality, that things have a substance, a weight. This is problematic. Just the concept is heavy. Seeing things as substantial. But if you see things as process, as verb rather than noun, then there's a lightness, there's a freedom there. Now this is another great advantage of seeing things in terms of not self, is a sense of freedom. The movement of the mind is not restricted in any way. It's not bound. It's not limited. We have different ways of cultivating that sense of boundlessness. Probably the most direct access into that is developing Brahmaviharas, developing metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity and extending them to infinity, then you have a sense of boundlessness of mind. It's one of the names of those, another name for those states, besides Brahma Vihara, is the boundless states. There's no limit. And it comes down to an attitude of mind, a way of holding the mind. It's not a theory to be understood or studied or developed, although there is an aspect to it. One can approach through like Abhidhamma and dependent origination. One can get a kind of intellectual approach to the idea of not self. That's not really the most spiritually productive route. It's learning that knack of holding the mind in a state of emptiness without a fixed, solid point of reference. And when we identify with anything, then we're putting a stake in the ground and fixing this point of reference as the center. But having no point of reference, finding no footing, having no boundary, is completely free. The emptiness is a full emptiness. You can think of it as a universal potential. There's an analog in modern physics and the idea of the quantum flux or the vacuum flux, that particles in empty space, in a vacuum, particles are continually appearing and disappearing. And this is because of the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You cannot determine absolutely the position and the momentum of a particle. And that's not a limitation of our perception, it's a limitation of the particles themselves. And if everything is zero, if there's an absolute vacuum, then you have zero position and zero momentum. That violates Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. So the universe, to keep the math straight, keeps throwing up photons and neutrinos and whatnot, and they immediately disappear as well. So the emptiness is a field of potential, and it's a universal, limitless potential. But when anything manifests, it's a limitation on the universal potential. It's a manifestation. Is by nature something temporary, bounded, and determined, conditioned. There's a way of looking at it to say that all kind of manifestation is a flaw. The fact of being in manifestation is a flaw for the perfection of the infinite voidness. And we can hold our mind in that emptiness by not identifying a self position. And there's so many ways that we do that, how we manifest the self. You can identify with the body or with the thoughts, the emotions, with the views, fixed views and opinions, and stake your ground there. The Buddha warned against holding any opinion rigidly. He said even these teachings of mine, if they're held improperly as a fixed dogma, will do damage. Just as kusa grass can cut the hand if improperly grasped. So this freedom is a fluidity of the mind. It's the ability of the mind to move in any direction, not fixed, because it's not fixed to a self-imposed limitation. And the seeing of emptiness as I say, it's essentially an attitude, a way of holding the mind, has to work in both directions. Emptiness inside, emptiness outside. Emptiness of the subject, emptiness of the object. The knowing mind is essentially void. There's nothing there. There's just the quality of knowing. There's just a process without a substrate. Simple knowing. And the objects that are known by the mind are in their nature intrinsically empty. This is something that's very important to see, and for some people seem to find it difficult, but when it's seen, it's very liberating, is to see the emptiness of your mental formations. We can suffer a great deal through mental processes. All the various anxieties, neuroses, unfulfilled desires, regrets. There's all these sort of negative mental forms that cause actual suffering. And all of that suffering is really, in the end, self-imposed. It's actually optional. You don't have to take that up. You can find this way of holding the mind to see that the knowing is empty and that which is known is empty. The mental formations are just insubstantial phantasms of the mind. They have no solidity, no weight. And if you're looking at them that way, then they don't have to be perceived as a burden. You can just let them go. Let them pass through like clouds drifting through a sky. Just a formation. And it's almost like a knack, a way of holding the mind. And until it's found, it can seem very difficult. It can be plagued by your thought forms or your emotions and feel so heavy and burdensome. But then when you see through them that there's really nothing there, they're just insubstantial, then they can dissipate very, very quickly. Now we try to find this the state of mind in various ways. We have the formal meditation. The various ways of doing Vipassana meditation in particular are designed to reveal the essential nature of the mind and the object. So it's a methodical, disciplined kind of introspection. And one is just observing the process as far as possible in a completely impersonal way, and not, or endeavoring not to be shifted from the point of just clear knowing, not get caught in the objects. And this is an exercise that we can do, and it's recommended that we do it. It's very, very helpful. But it is, in the end, as all meditation is essentially is an artificial activity. It's something that we do by restraining the body, sitting still, and disciplining the mind to behave in a certain way, observe objects or observe a chosen object. And this trains and facilitates the ability of the mind to see clearly. And what we're doing when we do a formal meditation is we're essentially creating artificially perfect ideal conditions for observing the mind. We're limiting external input as far as it's humanly possible, and not engaging in any extraneous activity. So we have the ideal condition to observe the mind. But it is, like I said, a kind of artificial exercise. And if you can only be peaceful and clear when you're sitting on the meditation cushion, then that's not really of great value. You have to be able to take it into activity, into the daily affairs, interacting with other people, doing work, uh, relaxing, you know, whatever activity you're involved in, you can hold the mind in such a way that it's clear and open and free. And that means not identifying a self position in that. No self inside, no self outside. Everything is unobstructed. This is a term used in Huaying Buddhism, is non-obstruction. It's one of the ways of looking at emptiness and not self. Is non-obstruction. There's no obstruction. There's absolute free movement of the mind. It's not obstructed because it's not bound by concepts of self, which is a artificially imposed limit, a boundary within the mind. Just let the mind be free. And you have this sense of boundlessness, non-obstruction. And it has the advantage of being very peaceful. It's a calm state of mind. And as I say, it's free, and it's free of fear and anxiety. And it's naturally conducive to positive states like compassion and loving kindness. And it's not compatible with negative states like anger and ill will and fear. And to see the self as empty is really a starting point. To see the whole world as empty is the other side of it. And that includes other beings, other people. We see them, these are also empty. They're product of conditioning and karmic patterns. There's no essential substance. And it's not a cold, detached kind of a mind. It is naturally conducive to compassion because you see that you share this essential quality of void nature with all beings. So you have, it engenders a sense of compassion. The only way you can be uncompassionate, the only way you can be cruel or selfish is if you have a fixed self position. Then there's me and the others, I got to look out for number one and watch out for these other ones. They're going to try to get the best of me. And this comes from having a self position staked out. But if you see all beings as sharing this intrinsic lack of a self substance, as not existing from their own side, there's a process going on of knowing mind taking an object, and that's happening within me, and it's happening within all of you all the time. And this is a universal factor. Always go back to one of my favorite stories is the one about the sixth Zen patriarch. There's another monk wrote the poem about polishing the mirror so that it continually polish the mirror so that it shines brightly and reflects the 10,000 things. And the sixth Zen patriarch, well, he wasn't yet the patriarch at this point, but he was this young, illiterate peasant boy that no one took seriously. And he had to get somebody to read him the poem, and he said, oh, that's nonsense. So rub that out and write this. He says, there is no mirror there is no dust, so there is no mirror, so where can dust settle, and what is there to polish? And this was then seen by the master, the fifth patriarch, and he said, "Oh, this guy, he's the one." So this is a very simple underlying trick of the mind. That all our practice and all the complicated stuff that we can think about and study, it's all pointing to this. Just how the mind is simply the knowing. And as long as we're in manifest samsaric existence, there's the knower and the known. There's subject and object. And this is the underlying duality of manifestation. And in the unconditioned, then even that duality is transcended. It makes no sense. But it is, you could say, the last duality to go. It's the duality between knowing and the known. And this is the dance of the mind that's going on in each moment. And this is the nature of existence. And the wonderful thing is that there's nobody doing the knowing. And there's nothing substantial that's being known. It's just the process of knowing and being known. Yeah. So you can work with this in a practical way, trying to find that space in your own mind. It helps if you have some disciplined meditation practice, but just at all times try and hold that position. And if you find yourself falling into negative mind states, then try and clarify that into the knowing and the known. For example, if you're feeling anxious or afraid, then try to see that as mind knowing fear, rather than feeling it as I am afraid, or I am anxious, or I am sad, or I am angry. You see it as mind knowing anger, mind knowing sadness. You let that emotional state be an empty, conditioned, impermanent process that's external to the actual knowing. Same with thoughts, thought formations, thinking or daydreaming or planning, scheming, remembering, all these different types of thoughts. They're a process, an empty process that can be known as external to the knowing mind. And there's this kind of continual interchange between the knowing and the known, because the nature of the unenlightened mind, there's always a desire to take an object. And that results in a kind of a perpetual dance, a sort of a two-step. The mind wants an object, it goes to the object, it takes the object, it's dissatisfied with the object, and it goes to another object. This is a continuous process. The mind trying to gratify, satisfy, complete itself by the taking of objects, and it's essentially unable to do that. And the process immediately becomes less troublesome, less burdensome, if you see it as that, as an impersonal, insubstantial, empty process. It's not me doing it. It's just stuff happening. So this mindfulness is one of the aspects. I started by quoting the Buddha's words to Mogaraja, and he said, "Be ever mindful, see the world as empty, and abandon thoughts of self." Being mindful is the way forward. It's the way of doing that. Being fully awake and aware and knowing of the process. There's a kind of a subtle shift in the mind you feel when you're mindful, when you're awake. You have bodhi. Things are clear. Whereas when you let mindfulness slip, then It's like you're sleepwalking. You're in a kind of a daze. You're just kind of going through the motions. This is, the delusion creeps in. If you're fully mindful, it's not possible to be really deluded because you're seeing things clearly, and this is how wisdom dawns. And see the world as empty. The second term in that advice is that externalizing the objects as empty. And see the whole world as empty. It's one of the Buddha's attributes is knower of the worlds. And the Tibetans have that mudra they make with their hands representing the Mount Meru and the four continents, and they call that the mandala offering. They make an offering of the whole world. In an article that I wrote for a Buddhist magazine some years ago, one of the magazine editors who read it over was an expert in Tibetan stuff, and I had interpreted that gesture in a very Theravadan way. My idea was that what it represents is you're renouncing the whole universe. Like you have the whole universe in your hand and you give it up. Yeah? Whereas the Vajrayana interpretation is that you're taking the big view. That's what they call it, taking the big view as a way of transcending the self. You're seeing the whole world as changing formations, as a way of entering into emptiness. I think both interpretations are equally valid. I think you renounce the whole world by not clinging to it as substantial. And see the world as empty, and see everything in it. It's not just a whole cosmic dance, but each individual component is empty. When we do Vipassana meditation, we're taking one Dhamma at a time, one discrete unit at a time. We're not taking a big view at that moment. We're taking a very minute view. We're just looking at the atomic structure of reality, and that's empty, that's empty, that's empty. But then taking the big view is seeing the whole thing, the whole complex, interwoven, intermeshed, constantly changing, moving panoply of reality, and seeing it's all emptiness. It's all just phantasm. Yeah. And abandon thoughts of self. So the third term is the internal, seeing, not taking a self position. And that's not finding the owner of the empty house. Wherever you try and pin down the idea of a self, it dissolves. It's like one of those infinite regresses in mirrors. If you ever lined up mirrors the right way, you can look down. It's like looking down a long tunnel of infinite regress. It's like wherever you try and pin down the idea of the self, there's something else behind it. There's no center point. There's no essential self, and there's no boundary. There's something I come across in a Christian writing was a kind of a metaphorical definition of God is a circle whose center is nowhere and whose circumference is everywhere. And this is how to see the self. There's no center. Center is nowhere. Without giving way to delusions of grandeur, it is sort of a godlike state of mind. There's no center and there's no limit. Seeing this knowing mind just as void, as empty process, it means not identifying it with any of the five khandha. It's not It's not the body, it's not the vijnana or the feelings, or it's just simply knowing. You know? In ordinary human consciousness, it operates through the vijnana, through the senses, through the sense organs and sense consciousness. But the end of the line, the simple knowing, is not based on anything. It's not restricted. It's not really definable, because there's nothing there to define. And when you abandon thoughts of self, is approaching it in a kind of via negativa, a kind of approaching that very subtle reality by paring away what it's not. Anytime you have an idea of that this is the self, then have a feeling that you can identify as self, then if you look at it, it dissolves. There is no, that doesn't work. It's not actually a self. The Buddha did this with looking at the five khandha and asking if any of them could be suitable to be identified as a self. And the idea of a self that he was working with, coming from Indian philosophy, is if something is truly yours, if it's really yourself, first of all, it should be permanent and unchanging. And if it's something that pertains to the self, like an attribute of the self or a belonging of the self, then you should have control of it. But all of the five khandha, when they're looked at, the components of a person, they're all constantly changing. The body, the feelings, the vijnana, the consciousness, the mental formations, they're all constantly changing from one moment to the next. And they're also outside of our control. Start with the body. You can't wish, may I be taller, may I be shorter, may I be fatter, may I be thinner. That cannot be had by mere wishing. Yeah. And then the feelings, may I be happy, may I always be happy. I can't see anyone wishing, may I be sad. But you can't have that by mere wishing. Our control over the khandhas is very limited, and it's certainly not in any way complete. And none of them are fixed. None of them are a fixed position. And what happens if you identify with any of the khandhas as a self is that you'll end up suffering, because they will change. The body changes, feelings change, and so on. And then you feel like your self has been damaged, and you feel distraught and suffering, rather than just seeing it as formations doing their thing. So I'll wind it up with one, last reflection, something I think I probably mentioned in talks before, but as a kind of a very short, useful reflection, is based on that sutta I was just talking about. The Buddha examines, four ways of creating a self. Is this, the body or the feelings, whatever, this aggregate is me, or it belongs to me, or I am in it, or it is in me. Right? So 4 ways. And a real shorthand for that is not me, not mine. And that's something you can bring up as a reflection when you find yourself troubled, or you find yourself in a fixed position, or suffering in some way from external or internal formations. It's not me, not mine. That even works with physical pain. If you've got physical pain from illness or injury, if you identify with it as, oh, my foot hurts, you stepped on a stone and your foot's sore, oh, my foot hurts, and you've got an irreducible amount of actual physical sensation, unpleasant physical sensation that is there. But then you add to it mental suffering that's entirely additional and optional and unnecessary by this kind of mental whinging that comes from identifying with it. But if you see it as not my foot hurts, but to see it there is painful sensation, then you're still stuck with the pain. That reflection doesn't help with the physical pain, but it eliminates the optional mental quality. Yeah? If you develop samadhi, you can also suppress the physical pain by just escaping from it. But that's a different consideration. So I'll just leave it with that. Not me, not mine, and looking at not self as an attitude of mind, a way of holding the mind.
And Mayam Dhamma Kataya Sadhu Kalam Dharamase Sadhu Sadhu Sadhu